Kittredge from the University of Massachusetts, presented by Ann Short.
I'm relatively new to this crowd. I've gotten into this landscape in the last 2 years from a long time in California. And so I'm pleased to be talking about some work that really I've just stepped into. And it's work that links up the social science side of the LTER research with lots of the efforts that are going on with the BU OPAC project. And it's work that I think has a lot of potential for feeding into the future scenarios as the LTER moves forward. So in the talk today, I'm going to talk about a specific project that we're just getting up and running and give some insights on how this builds on past work and feeds into future work. The project looks at conservation and land management practices at the individual and also organization and town level, and how those are linked to ecosystem services and disservices, which I'll talk about as well as we move forward. So I'm going to start actually with some motivation that Lucy skipped, which is the motivation for a project. There's two motivations. And the first one is the motivation for the idea of ultra as a whole, and certainly our BU ultra, which is the phenomenon of urbanization and global environmental change. At this point, over half of the global population is living in cities, which are comprising 3% of the global land cover, and that's expected to grow. By 2050, up to 70% of the population is expected to live in cities. And as Lucy mentioned, currently, people that are living in cities are emitting approximately 70 or 71% of the carbon dioxide emissions. And so from that, we see this very clear motivation of the need to think about human activities in cities and what humans are doing in cities. But we are also thinking about the need to think about urban ecosystems and thinking about ecosystems as they stretch from cities out to rural areas. And some of the reason we're doing that, we can see from the comparison of this graph, which is a MODIS image, showing vegetated areas across the world, where the green areas are the most green, and we're going to compare that to a night sky image, where, hopefully this is going to fade in, where we then see, now that you've all bowed, I have to, but I borrowed that slide from Lucy. But that was beautiful. So what you see is that a lot of those forested areas, and in particular, the whole northeastern United States, is also heavily populated. So these areas that we think of as urban are also home to a lot of vegetation. And so we need to start thinking about ecosystems, not just in rural areas, but also in urban areas, and thinking about the relationships back and forth. The second motivation for our project and for our approach comes from the opposite direction, in thinking about rural land use change in forest cover. Since the 1970s, across the United States and also rural areas in many other industrialized countries, there's been an influx of urban and suburban people into rural areas that are settling at low density residential development, which is changing some of the social conditions in these areas, economic conditions in these areas, and certainly then also having effects on the ecological conditions in these areas. So this is a figure that many of you will recognize from the Wildlands and Woodlands report, which shows population change in New England from 2000 to 2008, and then also shows the projected development of forests from 2000 to 2030. And something to notice is that in the central Massachusetts area, the percentage of private forest that is projected to be developed by 2030 ranges from 30 to 63%, which is a tremendous amount of the forest land that we're thinking about being affected by these new land uses. But important to think about that is to then couple that with the picture that we saw of these very peopled landscapes also being very green. And so when we think about what the implications of this development, of this forest loss are, actually for our ecosystems, we need to understand what the people that are taking over this land, using this land, living on this land, like many of us wish we were or are, what they're doing with their land, how they're managing it, the decisions that they're making, and also the decisions that local governments, state governments, NGOs, and other organizations are doing to preserve the land or to provide policies that are leading to development. And so, given this, we're interested in and thinking about what are the relationships between conservation, land management, development, and ecosystem services. And we're doing this and thinking about how these relationships differ, in particular with different levels of development. So trying to understand how human and ecological systems are coupled in different circumstances where there's different types of development and land use. And so our approach and our framework is thinking about these as a coupled natural human systems. And very much in line with the conceptual diagram that David Foster started at the beginning, thinking about the relationships back and forth between the social system and the structure and function of ecosystems. But I'm gonna break this down a little bit and talk a little bit about the specific areas that we're concerned with. The first is thinking about the link between social systems and ecosystems being actually the way that land is used and managed. And so when I talk about land use, I'm talking about very broad categories of land use. So this would be timber, agriculture, residential land use. When I talk about management, I mean the specific ways that people are putting those land uses into practice. So in timber, you can clear cut, you can do selective harvesting. With agriculture, you could choose to do till or no-till agriculture. There are lots of different decisions that we make that mean that land use for different purposes can be managed very differently. And these directly impact the structure and function of ecosystems. And so a lot of the work that's happened on the social science side of the LTER here has focused on characterizing the land use and management practices, particularly in western and central Massachusetts. Thinking about how ecosystems feed back into the social systems and how they impact the decisions that people make about their ecosystems, we can think about this by thinking about ecosystem services and businesses. And so ecosystem services is a concept that I imagine many or most of you are familiar with, which ecosystem services are the benefits that humans are deriving from ecosystems. So these are things that can be range from carbon sequestration to the regulation of air and water quality to recreational opportunities. These are benefits that we can measure in many cases, but they're also impacting human systems through the way that we perceive them. So our decisions as people aren't always based on the facts, but they're based on the ways that we think about the facts. And so the ecosystem disservices comes into play because we talk about ecosystems and the things that they provide that are good for us. But when people are actually making decisions about what they do, they're often thinking about the things that they want to avoid. So ecosystems provide some things we don't want. Ecosystems provide habitat for mosquitoes. Ecosystems provide habitat for vectors of different diseases like Lyme disease. And we can imagine people making decisions about their land use and management practices that are associated with trying to avoid those disservices. And so in thinking about the social system, there are many different aspects of the social system that we can focus on. People make decisions based on all sorts of economic constraints. They make decisions based on their knowledge. They make decisions based on just what they want to do. The aspects of the social system that we're focusing on are the institutions that influence what people do. So institutions is, in colloquial terms, often refers to organizations, but has a very specific meaning in the subfield of social science that I work in. And so institutions are actually talking about the social norms and rules that shape the way that people behave. And so institutions includes things like regulations, it includes formal laws, but it also includes all of the informal conventions and norms that we as society have adopted. And so it includes the social pressures that we have to behave in certain ways. It includes social norms of behavior, what you're expected to do and what you just take for granted. And so an institutional approach to thinking about these issues is interested in understanding how these institutions actually affect what people do. And it makes a distinction between what they call the rules in use, which are the rules that are on paper, Often we can think of these as the legal regulations or laws, and the rules and form, which are what people actually do. Because, you know, maybe the easiest example is thinking about driving on the highway. A posted speed limit is your rule in form, but certainly that doesn't mean that if we measured the speed that people are driving at, that's what we'd see. And so we're interested both in the rules in form, but also in the rules in use, and how those impact what people are doing. And then we're also interested in thinking about social capital and how that fits into the land use and management practices. And so social capital is a term that's used to encompass the idea that there are social relations that are particularly important for strengthening communities, strengthening the function of social systems. And so we can think about things that would increase social capital as things that increase our resilience as a community, things that increase our resilience as a family. And so some things would be strong family ties, strong neighborhood ties, strong networks of different organizations providing support. And these come into play with respect to conservation and land use and management practices because strong social capital can be associated with strong networks for providing information and education opportunities. They can be associated with strong outreach links from science to actually what people are doing. And it can be associated as well with sort of creating communities where thinking about conservation, land use, and management becomes important. And so in our project, we're interested in characterizing both these boxes and then also these arrows that are representing the relationships and the ways that these boxes feed into each other. The work that the LTER is doing has focused on thinking about the ecosystem structure and sewage function of the land that's along the two transects, which will also be on my slide in a second. The work that has been done on the social science side of the Harvard Forest LTER, as I think I just said, focuses on the land use and management practices and has started to really incorporate some of these ideas. The work that we're proposing to do moving forward on the social science side is focusing on all of these boxes and the relationships between them. And so to do this, we're using a multi-scalar approach, so we're looking at changes in behaviors at different scales at the parcel level as well as the town level, and the regional level, where I'm talking about regions in Massachusetts, not regions in New England, and trying to integrate social, biophysical, and spatial data across urban to rural gradients. And the gradients we're using are the transects that we have data on from the UltraX project. One of them, the northern one, is a really traditional urban to rural gradient. And it runs from Boston, a highly urbanized area, through suburbs, through lower density suburbs, and then out into rural areas. The southern transect runs along a major transportation corridor and is not as traditional in that it runs from a city to some suburbs, to a small city, and then to a big city, and then out into a rural area. And the reason why we're looking across urban to rural gradients is so that we can capture the diversity in the relationships between people, management practices, and ecosystem services with different levels of development and understanding how these relationships work together. What do? Well, Dave and I talk to people. We talk to people through focus groups. We bring people together. We talk to people through mail surveys. We ask them questions. We talk to people face-to-face in interviews. We also can do historical research, archive research, looking at past behaviors and why they've happened. And we integrate that with this spatial and biophysical data. So I want to highlight some areas where previous work here adds some insight into some of the questions. And so this is work that really gets at characterizing the land use and management and how this differs across the state. And so the map here shows characterization of private forest ownership that was based on parcels 3 acres or larger in 2005. And what you notice is not surprising, is that as you travel from east to west, you see that the average parcel size gets larger and larger. And this becomes important because parcel size and the characteristics of parcels are associated with options for management and what people are choosing to do and the likelihood of development. We can see this in also tallying and mapping of where forest harvests have happened. And so this was actually a tremendously large effort that happened to map all forest harvests from 1984 to 2003. And I think that the number was, I may be off by an order of magnitude, 408,000 or 48,000. Huge.
13,000.
13,000. I'm off by an order of magnitude of some unknown factor. 13,000 events, which is still huge. And so the black that you see mapped among this light green forest area represents areas where there are harvests. And so what you can see is that there are clear patterns to where people are harvesting on this landscape. We're harvesting west of 495, and we're not harvesting near these major transportation corridors. And so these patterns of management feed into and have already fed into some of the scenarios. And understanding how these patterns and management practices are changing can continue to feed into the scenarios for the future. Some previous work that's also been done is thinking about individual decision making and the factors that influence what these landowners in primarily central and western Massachusetts are doing with their land. So if you own a particular parcel at any given moment in time, you can choose to change that parcel. You can choose to sell your land, you can choose to buy land, you can choose to develop it, subdivide it, you can choose to harvest timber, you can choose to conserve it. There are all sorts of decisions that you can make. The moment when people make decisions tends to be associated with some outside event, losing a job. This is going to sound sad. Death in a family. Perhaps winning the lottery, we make decisions as well. But the choices that you make and what you do with your land is also associated with this broader social system, with your networks of knowledge, with the community that you're living in, the norms that are surrounding you. And so in thinking about that, some work that we have in progress is trying to understand knowledge that these landowners have when they're making decisions. Knowledge that they have about different management programs that exist that are aiming to provide incentives to maintain large parcels and to make conservation and environmentally friendly land management practices more common. And so Dave, working with two of his master's students, first developed a tool that was used to assess awareness, familiarity, and use of 4 different management programs. And they piloted it in 5 communities in western Massachusetts that are in this green color. They then subsequently did a round of administering the survey to communities that are in this light blue color that are scattered throughout central and western Massachusetts. And we are in the process just about to deploy the survey along our LTER transects. And so what the survey does is it asks familiarity with the current use forest tax program, which is a tax incentive for keeping your land in open or productive use. Familiarity with conservation easements, which are controls on how land is used that is usually associated with a tax break as well. Timber harvest, familiarity with sources of information about timber harvests, and then also estate planning and use and familiarity with resources for estate planning. And so in those first 2 rounds that they found that conservation awareness is related to parcel size. The larger your parcel, generally the more knowledge you have about these programs. Education, the higher your level of education, the more knowledge you have about these programs. The distance that you're living from the land. So the further that you're living from the land, the less knowledge that you're likely to have from about these programs. There are lots of absentee landowners who may be less engaged with the land that they're owning. It's also linked and correlated with the proportion of the community that's developed, but not in a clear and easy way. And so what they found is that in very rural places where there's very low levels of development, you see very low levels of conservation awareness. Also, in areas that are highly developed by central Massachusetts standards, you also see low levels of conservation. And it's the areas that are in the middle, that are have middle levels of development, that are possibly in undergoing changes, where you're seeing higher levels of awareness of these tools. And we can think of lots of reasons why that could happen. we can think that the pressure on land in those areas is increasing the value of the land, which makes estate planning, which makes conservation easements and tax breaks much more important. And so what we're doing now in this implementation is trying to understand how meaningful these conservation tools are as you continue moving east into more and more urban areas. Also thinking about analyzing conservation awareness, which the scores from the tool are indicated by these circles in the pilot areas, where the darker blue the circle is, the higher your level of awareness is. Thinking about how that's related to your position on the landscape, both socially and then also with respect to other actual physical, biophysical features of the landscape. So thinking about doing analysis of clusters of knowledge, where trying to understand if different areas have different networks that increase their knowledge about conservation, and then also thinking about how, if and how proximity to various open spaces may or may not be associated with higher levels of conservation awareness. And so moving forward, we are adding new dimensions to this research that's trying to link all of the whole cycle of thinking about ecosystems, ecosystem services, social systems, and land use and management practices. The first aspect we're doing is adding an institutional perspective of this. And we're asking questions like where, when, and why have formal conservation designations been used to protect forest land and open space? Or questions like how does social capital shape conservation, land use, and management practices in different areas along our urban to rural gradients? We're also adding attention to ecosystem services and disservices. We're thinking about what are the key ecosystem services and disservices that people are saying shape their land use and management decisions. So we can model all the ecosystem services that we can think of and value them as much as we think of, but if we're actually interested in these levers that we're talking about, what people do and why they do them, we need to know what they perceive as important. We can also think about that from a conservation perspective. What are the ecosystem services and disservices that are shaping formal conservation and land use planning processes? And are ecosystem services or disservices shaping formal conservation processes at all? There are lots of instances where decisions about what to conserve and why to conserve it are less associated with ecosystems than one might expect. We're also thinking about the meaning of conservation and different conservation practices across the gradient and how those are associated with development. So I have a student who's about to start a round of interviews asking professionals how the meaning of conservation and the practice of conservation varies across urban, suburban, and rural areas. And so what does it mean when we think about having all of these different ecosystems and development types? What does it mean if we want to know whether an urban landowner is a good conserver or not versus a rural landowner? And so we're also then taking all of these insights and linking these to some of the biophysical and social and spatial data that we have coming out of the LTER project. And thinking about how this links to future scenarios, the development and understanding of individuals' management practices and then also the formal conservation practices and land use planning processes really aids in the development, but also the interpretation of scenarios. And this gives us a better understanding of the current and potential human activities at multiple scales. And so we've already seen how data on management and land use properties can feed into the scenarios and the current use circumstances. But then it also can give us insight on the interaction of both individuals and also institutions. And as Jonathan was talking, I was thinking about how the selection process for building these scenarios focuses on or draws from the statistical analysis. And what Dave and I are starting to do can also add insight into what the actual mechanisms are that are leading to the relationships that he's seeing through his data mining process. And that adds insight not only into seeing what possible futures are, but understanding what these policy levels are, or levers are. And so I'm going to stop there with just a few thanks to people and funders.
So great to see the social science behind some of the ecosystem studies that we're looking at, and I thought it was fascinating to see the spatial distribution of conservation awareness in this talk. So I'm going to thank Aaron. If there are any questions, we have time. Great, so that was a nice, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Adrian.
When I talk to people about climate change or conservation or whatever, and invariably a lot of people are like, yeah, well, I don't really care. But what they really do care about is money. So I was wondering, are you doing anything about money with any of this? Are you talking to people about money, about how much money they can make, like keeping their forests, or anything related to financial?
So that's not explicitly included in the questions that we're asking now, but that's something that comes up in conversations. So in past work that I've done where I talked with landowners about what they're doing and why they're doing it, one of the questions that you ask is, are there things that you'd like to do that you're not doing, and why aren't you doing them? And money often gets added into the equation there. There's certainly been research, particularly with ranching communities, about the possibility of doing carbon credits and carbon storage and carbon sequestration activities. And there's no reason why we couldn't start to think about research like that on this landscape as well.
So one of the fascinating things that we've discussed, and I'm not sure exactly how you're going to pursue this, is that we oftentimes talk about an individual's understanding of conservation or appreciation of conservation, but as you point out, there are lots of different types of conservation knowledge, types of conservation and conservation guidance. How are you going to get at that? Because an urban population that may know nothing about forest practices and regulations and so on may know everything about national and global issues in conservation.
Yeah, so we're careful definition is sort of the short answer. And what I mean by that is what I'm interested in this project in particular is actually what people are doing on their land in small parcels and then also in big parcels. And so when I talk about conservation in that aspect, if you have all the knowledge you want in the world, like about the world and the local circumstances, and then you're applying all sorts of chemical pesticides and fertilizers on your lawn, then there's a disconnect between what you're doing and what you identify as, which is very common. That's one of the most common environmental disconnects among upper middle class educated people in the United States. Is sort of our knowledge and attitudes about lawns and what we actually do with our lawns. And actually, something that's just kind of interesting is that the more people know about bad effects of lawn care, the more likely they are to use lawn care. There's a tremendous and sometimes self-aware disconnect between how people identify what they do. And so this is skirting your question a little bit, but what we're interested in is not necessarily how can you have good knowledge about conservation globally, but what are you doing with your land and why are you doing it?
So this is a question maybe for you and for Lucy. I'm not sure who to ask it to, but you had some statistics about carbon emissions in cities compared to rural communities, and I guess I just have some concerns about that strict division, given that distinction is rapidly fading away. And if you look at our land use patterns in Vermont, it's very difficult in many areas to say what is a city, what is rural, what sort of exurban development and that sort of thing. And the reason I'm asking this question in terms of carbon emissions is that in Vermont, just as an example, we have very, very low emissions from what you would strictly define as an urban source or an industrial source, but in terms of transportation emissions, we're among the highest in the country, and that's because we are considered rural, and those people have to drive long distances. Many of them are commuting into economic hubs of one sort or another, Montpelier, Burlington, Waterbury, someplace like that. So coming back to the question, when you calculate those emissions, how are you attributing the transportation emissions? Where are you attributing them to? Are they attributed to the economic hub that people are commuting into? Are they attributed to the county where they live? And if you redistributed those in a different way, would it change some of your calculus, the comparison of urban versus rural?
So I'm going to start and then I'm going to let Lucy finish. But so the motivation behind your question is exactly why we are not looking at the metropolitan Boston area as defined by just definitions of what urban is, and why we're taking the approach of going from urban to rural. Is trying to understand the movement of people back and forth between these areas, the way that different development patterns are associated with different practices. The specifics about how transportation emissions are attributed to different sources is out of my...
So it's a giant can of worms. There's no universal definition of urban. There's, in the paper that my postdoc Speaks for CD led and is coming out next month in Ecological Applications, looks at 4 different definitions of urban in Boston, and how the answer you get if you define urban differently varies. So there's no universal magic urban answer. There's a census answer. That's one answer. And the attribution question, is it driven by demand? Because demand is driving electricity generation. The generation may take place elsewhere. That's another can of worms. And different emissions inventories attribute it differently. They sometimes attribute it to where the demand is, and sometimes they attribute it to where it's being produced. For transportation specifically, transportation is usually distributed along the roadway, or dependent, in the MPO example, they use traffic analysis zones, and so it's one value of that traffic analysis zone, but it's where the cars are actually driving. And Connor Gately, his dissertation is very focused on exactly that transportation question. So no nice answer for you.
I have a quick and somewhat similar follow-up question to that one. You started the talk by saying 70% of emissions come from urban areas. What percent of people are in urban areas in your model?
Right now, about 50%.
So in the United States, the number is higher. Globally,
Yes,
it's about
yeah.
50. In the United States, it's 80. Yeah.
Aha, so then it's a little bit less per capita in your model. If it's 80% and 70, anyway.
It's unclear because both of those numbers at the beginning are global numbers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, we have some announcements before lunch.